Welcome to Artist Space Books and Talks. Thank you for coming tonight and being a committed audience. Small audience, but committed audience. So this event forms part of a series of talks and screenings that we're running under the title Public Bodies, Private Parts, which we've organized as part of our curatorial programming partnership with the Whitney Biennial 2012. So this series takes as its starting point instances in which biennial artists have revisited and represented transgressive biographies. In particular, the inclusion of the work of Forrest Bess in the biennial overseen by Robert Gober, and the research into the notebooks of Tatsumi Hijikata within Richard Hawkins' work. So collectively, these talks and screenings are intended to consider the overlap between artistic production, the representation of desire, and notions of perversion. Centered on the biographies of particular individuals, they also touch on processes of obscuring and unveiling in the historicization of marginalized actions. So tomorrow evening there will be a talk from writer Mark Turner on Forrest Bess, along with a screening of the documentary Key to the Riddle. And tonight we are very pleased to welcome the biographer Justin Spring to speak about Samuel Steward, a poet, novelist, and university professor, and later tattoo artist and pornographer. Across Steward's working life in the middle of the part of the 20th century, he maintained a detailed personal archive of his sexual experiences across a number of assumed identities, acting as an unofficial collaborator with Alfred Kinsey and his Institute for Sex Research. Having died in obscurity, the extent of Steward's archive has only become apparent in the last decade, predominantly through Justin's research, and presents a counter-narrative to the predominant repression of homosexuality during his lifetime. So Justin Spring is a New York-based writer specializing in 20th century American art and culture. He is the author of many monographs, including the biography Fairfield Porter, A Life in Art, and Paul Cadmus, The Male Nude. His biography of Samuel Steward, The Secret Historian, The Life and Times of Samuel Steward, Professor, Tattoo Artist, and Sexual Renegade, was published in 2010. So we're very happy to have Justin here, and pass over to you now. I think there'll be opportunity for questions at the end of Justin's presentation.
Great. Thank you, Richard. It's a pleasure to be here at Artist Space. And I'm glad you all were able to turn up on such short notice. We only announced the talk about 12 hours ago, so you folks get to be a very intimate group to see and hear about Sam Steward. 2 weeks ago, I was giving the same talk to a crowd of about 400 people at Ohio State University. So without getting too much into the Whitney Biennial, I just want to say that I came to Sam Steward's life as an art historian and art writer, and it has always been my experience that artists get to truths that are profound and challenging in a way that writers can't often do. What amazed me when I stumbled across the Sam Steward archive as I was doing other research was that Sam not only kept enormous amounts of written documentation of his sexuality, but also created a great deal of artwork about it, and documentary photography, and journalism, and poetry. So he was getting at sexuality from all different angles, so to speak, and the visual is a very important part of that. While I spent many years writing the biography, and I can't possibly recapitulate all of that information for you this evening in the brief period of time that I have, I am going to be able to show you a great deal of visual material that is otherwise unavailable to you, either online or in the book. I'd also like to recommend the large format book that I published in conjunction with Secret Historian, which is called An Obscene Diary, The Visual World of Sam Steward. It was published in a very limited edition, but the idea was that this visual material is so important and so much a part of Sam Steward's creative endeavor that to publish a biography without making that visual material available would be a disservice to Sam and everything that he stood for. So just to get started, I want to say that Secret Historian was a very difficult book to publish, and one of the reasons is that not only did Sam have a highly interdisciplinary life, but he also had a profoundly erotic one, and the two in combination with homosexuality made for an almost impossible cocktail for most publishing houses to swallow. I had actually come to biography through my first project, Fairfield Porter: A Life in Art, which is published by Yale Press and is a literary intellectual biography about a visual artist who was also a wonderful critic, a poet, and a fantastic correspondent. So that dichotomy of the visual man who was also deeply involved with language was with me very early on. My next project after Fairfield Porter was Paul Cadmus, The Male Nude. And as I finished that monograph on Cadmus's nude drawings and the way in which they challenged taste and propriety of mid-century America in the 20th century, I began to realize that I wanted to write a group portrait biography, a life and times biography of an entire group of gay and bisexual men, and in some cases women, who had been involved in a similar project throughout the 1930s, 40s, and 50s of documenting their sex life and somehow moving towards the inclusion of non-mainstream sexuality into the contemporary cultural dialogue. In fascinating works like The Fleet's Inn or Sailors and Floozies, Paul Cadmus had created a kind of coded language in which homosexuality was considered part of everyday life in New York when the fleet came to town. He also went into places like the YMCA locker room and looked at the ways in which male bodies interacted. In a very profound way, though, his work went back to the Renaissance and to masters like Luca Signorelli. I think what happens among artists is they realize that the truth about sexuality or beauty or desire can be presented in a visual way, even if the cultural dialogue, the verbal dialogue that's going on prohibits us from discussing, say, homosexual desire. So in riffing off other artists and building an awareness based on previous artistic achievements, people like Cadmus were moving the project of gay liberation forward in a very slow and rather crafty way. And of course, the portrayal of erotic desire of men for men is something that has been going on for centuries. Here we have an amazing photograph by Baron Corvo, Frederick Rolf Baron Corvo. It's one of his nude male studies from Italy. We have Baron William von Gluden, who is doing his erotic nudes in Taormina in Sicily. F. Holland Day, who was engaging with the male form, beautiful young male bodies up in Boston. So there's a tradition in photography in particular of the male nude and the way in which an emotion which can't necessarily be written down or expressed in public can be expressed through a visual image. Working from Hippolyte Flandrin, we have in later days Robert Mapplethorpe. Mapplethorpe, in fact, I later discovered, had been influenced by George Platt Lynes, who had been introduced to some of his black models by SamuelSteward. So Sam Steward is a person who, although he's not necessarily part of a dialogue that continues up through the 1970s with these Mapplethorpe photographs with the gay liberation and the transgressive presentation of homoerotic desire, is somebody who was on the ground floor working with artists, with sex researchers, with writers, and creating a profound archive all his life of images, data, and writings that would someday come to light. And in fact, that entire archive, for the most part, was with him when he died in his bungalow in 1993, and it was discovered by me in around 2002 when I went to San Francisco and spoke with his executor. Here is the sort of central or linchpin object that was central to my study of Sam Steward. It's called his stud file, and it's his lifelong record of every person that he ever had sex with. This is a massive undertaking. He was by nature a sexual record keeper, and he was encouraged in that record keeping by Alfred Kinsey. But it's this rather amazing document, which is about just shy of 1,000 cards long, that was a kind of amazing bibliography, source material for me as I was reconstructing his life. Here's some of the other very disturbing objects that I uncovered in his archive when I visited in 2000, I think it was 2002. These are some of the disciplinary devices that I found. And I took crude photographs because I was in such a rush to get them all documented for preservation. But what does an art historian or a biographer make of things like manacles or blackjacks or police billy clubs and handcuffs? Or albums in which Sam Stewart himself is having huge amounts of sex with unknown men, some of them known, I later discovered. These are photographs taken with his Polaroid camera in his apartment. And then collecting also erotic art that had basically been in his home since he had acquired it in the late 1950s. You can see some of the dust and filth that was on these archival objects as they were recovered from the attic where I found them in San Francisco in 2002. At this point, I took all of these objects back with me to New York and began the very long process of stitching Sam Stewart's life together, using not only the monumental archive that I'd found in San Francisco, but other published documents, books that he'd published, books that friends had published, and then doing independent research. His life began in Woodsfield, Ohio, where he was pretty much orphaned at a young age. At age of 6, his mother died and his father abandoned him. He was raised by 2 maiden aunts who kept a boarding house. As a young high school student, he was sexual from his early teens onward and made a habit or practice of seducing other boys, both in the small town where he grew up of Woodsfield, but also in Columbus, Ohio, where he moved as a teenager. It was here at age 16 that he, as part of his project of seeking autographs, met and seduced Rudolph Valentino, keeping a swatch of his pubic hair as a souvenir of their sexual encounter in this Deschler Wallach Hotel in downtown Columbus. But his actual life experience was very much that of an intellectual and of a would-be poet. So even as he was attending Ohio State University, he was writing papers on Walt Whitman, one of his great heroes. Oscar Wilde was another great hero. Joris Karl Huysmans and these wonderful novels of late 19th century France describing lives of extreme decadence had great appeal for him. He was also briefly converted to Catholicism, and his research on Cardinal Newman led him to conclude that Newman had been homosexual, something that he alluded to in his dissertation, which passed, and Sam was a Phi Beta Kappa student at Ohio State University and very well set up as a young professor. His first posting was in Montana in the mid-1930s, 1935, at a place called Carroll College. He then went to the Washington State University at Pullman. Even as he was doing this, though, he was documenting his early sexuality not only through sexual record keeping, but also through written statements about how he understood his sexuality and how he was going to somehow manage to be the sexual person that he was and at the same time fit into society. It was a great challenge, particularly as a young professor. He knew that he lived in what was basically a fishbowl. He was under enormous amounts of scrutiny, and that it would be very difficult for him, if not impossible, to live with another man and at the same time to maintain a faculty position at a university. He did a great deal of corresponding with figures in Europe, literary figures and artistic figures that he had a passion for. Lord Alfred Douglas, for example, was not only a correspondent with Sam Stewart, but the two of them had sex in 1937. Sam kept extremely careful diaries of his travels from 1937, 1939, 1950, 1952, 1953, and 1954. We have extraordinary documents, day-by-day documents of his sexual travels in Paris, San Francisco, New York, and in Rome. Sam, in summer of 37, also met André Gide. He was tracking down literary figures whose writings on homosexuality had been of great importance to him. And he found a great early mentor in Gertrude Stein. This is a Polaroid that he snapped at her country home in Billigny, France, working in the tomato patch. Thornton Wilder was introduced to Sam Steward through Gertrude Stein, and first in 1937 and then again in 1939, where this photograph was taken, Wilder and Steward had a sexual affair, which went on until around 1948. This particular photograph was snapped by Steward in the hotel room where Oscar Wilde had died in Paris. So you see Sam creating through these visual documents a link between himself and not only culture, but also homosexuality as it's embodied in individuals who are cultural luminaries who also happen to be homosexual. Sam felt that by joining himself not only intellectually but also physically with these people, he was somehow making his way in the world and connecting himself to something greater and more important than his own sexuality. He began, as a young man, keeping various kinds of documentation of his sex life. He was a lifelong record keeper and kept records of just about everything. It's one of the great challenges of writing his biography was to sort through all of this information, a lot of which is trivial, and come up with the most important or sort of keynote moments of 1 year after the next. As World War II came on, he found he had a passion for men in uniform, and this in particular, officer named Bill Collins was an important lover for him. But he began during this period not only to study art at the Art Institute of Chicago, but also to obsess on sailors, not only by having sex with them, by tracking them down in the bars of Chicago. Chicago is a great training center for young sailors because of the Great Lakes Naval Training Station, which is just north of the city of Chicago. He also would obsess on them by creating artworks about them or by writing pornography that included them. This is one of his earliest pornographic productions called Bell-Bottom Trousers. The only extant copy of it is in the Kinsey Institute, and it was through a lot of detective work that we were able to identify it as by Sam. The Kinsey had never heard of it before, and when I began describing it, we were able to figure out that it had been misfiled long ago. Steward was a university professor in Chicago from 1937 onwards. He taught first at Loyola University, then at DePaul. He took a brief break during the late 1940s to rewrite the World Book Encyclopedia. He was a man of extraordinary intelligence, very wide-ranging intelligence, and an extraordinary clear and concise writer. Here he is at the World Book, signing copies and working on documents. The World Book Encyclopedia was rewritten in what was then called the Pure Oil Building in downtown Chicago, and it was here, through a contact that he made in the men's room on the floor where he worked, that Sam began writing long pornographic missives that he would swap back and forth. This correspondence, which is known as the toilet correspondence, was lovingly kept by Sam throughout the 1940s and into the 50s when he donated it to the Kinsey Institute. So in it, many of the early sexual experiences that he'd had in the 20s, the 1930s, and the early 1940s are turned into a fictional version thereof, and that this is the kind of the prototypical pornography that he would go back to write later in the 1960s and 70s. University professor by day, man of mystery by night, he definitely lived a compartmentalized identity. He was a much-loved university professor and a very brilliant man, but he also was troubled. He was for 25 years, he was a profoundly alcoholic person. For most of the years of his professorship, in fact, he was drinking more than a quart of bourbon a day, and it was as he got sober in the late 1940s that he began to realize that academia was driving him crazy, and that the better way to live his life would be to live as a profoundly sexual person and to engage in the thing that he really enjoyed most of all, which is to draw on virile young male bodies with a tattoo needle. And it was here at his apartment in just north of DePaul University in Chicago that he began creating artworks, studying tattooing, and building an archive and a kind of treasure trove of homosexual awareness that was subsequently documented by Alfred Kinsey and his research team in photos such as these, which were taken around 1953 and 54. You see Sam's amazing collection of sexually themed bibelots, his first edition novels and works of nonfiction on homosexuality, bent wire sculptures and paintings that he himself had made of the male form, over and over again, he was creating wilder and wilder evocations of sexuality, in part to incite the men who came to visit him at his apartment to get involved in group sexual activity. He also briefly flirted with the idea of becoming a pornographic illustrator. This is one of a series of illustrations that he did for a company called Thor, these drawing sets were sold in the back of bodybuilding magazines. They're really quite amazing works of art, and they are actually based on a story that had been in circulation underground in gay America from the mid-1940s onwards. Sam's apartment, again, this is documented by the Kinsey research team, had a lot of surprises in it. That when the Murphy bed folded down, the first mural that was there was of a motorcyclist having sex with a floozy. It's a heterosexual image. Sam was usually bedding heterosexual men, and so he would create images that he thought would excite the men he was seducing, hence the sailor, the motorcyclist and floozy. Of course, people like Alfred Kinsey and his research team were completely fascinated by Sam, not only because of extraordinary record keeping, but also because of his profound engagement with culture, his connection to high culture and to literary figures, as well, and low culture, street people. Kinsey, too, had been involved in academia for many, many years as a zoologist, but in his actual field research of interviewing people about their sexuality, he was actually going out into the streets, into bars, meeting average people all across America and interviewing them about their sexual habits and practices. The rest of the research team are also very good friends of Sam Steward during the many years, I guess this 7 years that they worked together. Wardell Pomeroy on my right, Paul Gebhard, an amazing anthropologist who I had the pleasure of meeting at the end of his life, Alfred Kinsey, and Clyde Martin, the handsome fellow that everybody took a shine to at the Institute. It was during this period in the early 1950s that Sam was getting to know Kinsey that he went back through his early stud files and reorganized them and created the card catalog that we see here today. Here's examples of a few of the cards in the stud file catalog. These are anonymous ones. I try to protect the names of people who had sex with Sam in case their families or children are sitting in the audience. But usually a stud file card would include the name of the person or some kind of identifier, the date of their first sexual encounter, including the place. The H and TK are references to the penile dimensions, H meaning huge, TK meaning thick. And then the codes on the right-hand side would be about the kind of sexual act that they engaged in. Certain of these cards in the catalog have entries running up into the hundreds. Others are just one-time events. Sam also acquired a very early Polaroid camera in 1951, and with the passion and zeal of a person who was mechanically inclined, he began documenting sex parties in his home on a regular basis. Some of the photos are really quite wonderful, and he gets involved in a lot of artistic evocations that are above and beyond the call of mere documentation. I'll show you a few in a minute. But also, you can see some of the documentation, day-by-day documentation of his sexual acts here. And you can see the catalogs or books that he was putting together of sexual activity, including Polaroid photographs, which he would show to people who would come to his house for a party, which would turn into a sex party, usually by the middle of the evening. Here we have an interesting juxtaposition, first of a sailor getting turned on and having a drink before a sex party, and then Alfred Kinsey sitting in the same chair, taking notes. Kinsey and his team actually did attend a few of these sex parties and took notes and recorded what guys got up to when they had orgies, because this had never been documented before. And while it seems kind of ludicrous to us today because we have access to all kinds of pornography and video materials that tell us how people have sex, it really was, we're at a moment in culture in which something that had never ever really been talked about scientifically before was now being cataloged, identified, and discussed for the first time. Here's a very interesting Polaroid of a group sexual activity in Sam's apartment. This is called a daisy chain. Here's one of the more interesting creations that Sam put together using manipulation of the emulsion of the photographic stock and strong light fixtures. That's his own body. He actually he had a timer that he used on his Polaroid. And so we have him engaging with phantasmagorical figures in his sexual activities as well. And we also see the evolution of the murals in his home as he becomes more and more comfortable with his homosexuality and he wants to celebrate it more and more. His line illustration drawing style, which borrows a lot from Cocteau, begins to show two men reclining happily together, having a cigarette after sex. The young sailor sitting on the bedpost here was actually a very dear and important person in Sam Steward's life, who I write about quite a bit in the book. And much to my surprise, after the book was published, he wrote me from his home in the Midwest. He's now an elderly librarian, and he wrote a very charming and sweet note about how important a person Sam had been to him in his life. Sam had a very strong fantasy life. He'd always dreamt of being a sailor. He loved the sexuality of sailors. And so there's a series of portraits that he took with a self-timer on his Polaroid that captures him in his sailor garb. He joined the Navy briefly, but was drummed out because he had food allergies. So the fantasy of someday being just a sailor was one that he had to live with all his life. Even so, as he was having all of these wild sexual escapades in Chicago, he was also continuing his literary life as a very close friend of Alice Toklas. There's a great deal of correspondence with Toklas in the biography. And we're again looking at some of the documentation of his sex life while in Paris during the summer, I believe, of 1950 or 52. Sam, at the very strong urging of Kinsey, began not only keeping diaries in which he described his literary and social activities in Paris, but also his many assignations. And he kept a running stud file record in the margins about who he was having sex with and what they got up to, which he would then incorporate into the stud file when he got back to Chicago. During this period, he became very close friends as well with George Platt Lynes, who was, of course, a good friend of Paul Cadmus. Sam became friends with Paul Cadmus as well, and Jared French, and a whole group of artists who were living in New York, who were also fascinated with the male form, male beauty, and male sexuality. Here we have a fantastic photograph, which is actually the frontispiece for my biography, for my book on Paul Cadmus, The Male Nude. It's an image taken by George Platt Lynes in Lynes' studio of Paul Cadmus drawing the male nude. A fellow named Ralph Skinner, who was a very good friend and sometime lover of Paul Cadmus's. Again, an amazing George Platt Lynes photograph of a young man named Johnny Leaphart that Sam had met, bedded, and then later introduced to George Platt Lynes. He became a favorite model of Lynes, and it was these rather amazing images of Johnny Leaphart and Buddy McCarthy that are among the strongest in the George Platt Lynes body of work. During summers of 1953 and 54, Sam moved not to Paris, but he went west instead to San Francisco, hearing that it was a great gay mecca. And this photograph, which is a little bit light, I took just a couple of years ago when I was doing my research. It's the Embarcadero YMCA, which is still on the waterfront in San Francisco. It's now been turned into a luxury boutique hotel, so it's not the same rough and ready place that it used to be, but it was here that Sam was able to meet, befriend, and bed quite a few young men just off the high seas or coming out of the service, and his documents and journals and fiction relating to the Embarcadero YMCA are some of the most extraordinary things that I came across in my years of research on his life. Here's an amazing image. It is actually a letter to George Platt Lynes, beautifully typed on handmade stationery, describing Sam's sexual adventures at the Embarcadero YMCA. And the illustration, which is strongly influenced by Cocteau, of course, really makes manifest in image what's going on in the written word as well. Sam had huge amounts of sex while he was in San Francisco, and to express that excitement about it, he would create these images and text that he put together and sent off to Lynes. Here's some of the stud file cards from the Embarcadero YMCA, all of it cataloging only the anonymous encounters. There were separate cards for the encounters with people he actually knew. But of course, after the experience of the Embarcadero, he had to come back and teach again as a university professor in Chicago. This was in the DePaul yearbook. Sam was teaching at DePaul at the end of his career. And he ran what was called the Culture Corner, which was a culture club that introduced young students to the world of the ballet, the opera, concerts, music, the fine arts. So again, we have a fully rounded man who was not only highly cultural, but at the same time wildly sexual. By 1956, however, Sam had decided that it was time to call it quits with being a university professor, and instead he began to run a tattoo parlor. The sign for his tattoo parlor was the rose, and the rose is a symbol of masculine desire. But it also is a reference as well to Sam's old friend Gertrude Stein, whose rose is a rose is a rose was a byword for her literary genius, and this was one of her visiting cards from the Rue de Fleurus that Sam held on to. But his tattoo parlor was on South State Street, which is a very rough part of Chicago, and it was in this tattoo parlor that he would create a kind of a back room where sex could happen all the time. And so rather than breaking his life into a highly organized tattoo world and then a very private sex world, the sex was going on in and around the tattoo parlor for most of the late 1950s. Here he is in front of Phil's tattoo joint. There were a lot of coded images within the tattoo parlor that actually let people know who would come in to have tattoos made that this was a place that was run by a homosexual man who would probably be willing to have sex with any sailor. He refused, however, to barter tattoos for sex. That's where he drew the line. Here are some Polaroids taken at the tattoo parlor of handsome young men having their tattoos documented. These are extraordinary images. Sam also kept a very detailed diary of his life at the tattoo parlor, again at the insistence of Alfred Kinsey. This is a 1,000-page typewritten document that is an absolutely extraordinary account of what it was to live in and among the rough people of South State Street. And it's not only about tattooing and about life on the street, but it's also it's a confessional diary about his sexual life, which was an extremely wild sexual life, particularly as the 1950s came to a close. His life became more and more cut up with rough sex, S&M sex, bondage and discipline sex, and a certain number of death fantasies that were being acted out or worked out through sexual encounters that he was paying for. Even as he was doing this, though, he had become a very whimsical and lighthearted illustrator for the Swiss homophile publication Der Kreis, to which he contributed greatly, not only as a literary man, but as an illustrator. Der Kreis was one of the first magazines that let men speak openly about homosexual desire, and Sam, although he was far away in Chicago, became a regular correspondent. In fact, the greatest English language correspondent the magazine ever had. You can see some of his tattoos. As the 50s went on, he became more and more tattooed. The tattoos were also declarations of his sexuality. So we have a winged phallus surmounted by a whip to describe his sadomasochistic interests. The rose at the center of his chest, again, the emblem of male desire. You can't quite see it here, but that rose actually features the phallic meatus at its heart. It's actually the head of a penis at the center of the rose design. Around the mid to late 1950s, Sam met this extraordinary character named Chuck Renslow, who would later go on to open Chicago's first leather bar, the Gold Coast, and then in the 1970s found the International Mr. Leather competition, which has been running strong for the past 30 years in Chicago. And it was through Renslow, who ran a gym and a series of magazines, that Sam became introduced to a number of bodybuilders and hustlers whose services he bought with increasing regularity as he moved into his mid to late 40s and early 50s. Some of them he had very strong love affairs with, including this young man. But his early 50s were also a time of sort of coming to accounts with who he was and where he was in the world. Here we have a picture of him meditating at Keats' grave in the Protestant cemetery in Rome. He had gone there to visit Alice Toklas, who was living there in retirement. So even in the middle of this wild sexual life, he's living the life of a thinker and a ruminator. By by the early 1960s, Sam had decided to leave Chicago. He began mentoring a wonderful tattoo artist named Cliff Raven during those last years in Chicago. Together, they opened a tattoo parlor up in Milwaukee after Chicago outlawed tattooing for young men under the age of, I think, 20. And so we have some of these last wonderful images that were taken in the Wisconsin tattoo parlor of Sam tattooing young boot sailors from the Great Lakes Naval Training Station. You can see the boredom on his face. There was a lot of boredom and downtime in the tattoo parlor, and so when he wasn't having sex or putting a nice tattoo on a handsome young sailor, Sam was often tapping away on his journal, saying what was going on in his life. Around 1965, Sam moved to Berkeley, California, and began the final phase of his life living in this small bungalow hidden away behind a larger house in the flatlands of Berkeley, between Berkeley and Oakland. He had a number of friends who had led him to San Francisco, including this rather amazing Catholic priest turned BDSM enthusiast named Father Jim Kane, who was quite famous in San Francisco and remains revered in the leather community even to this day. Sam opened a tattoo parlor in Berkeley, California, right at the time of the free speech movement and the birth of the Black Panther movement in Oakland. This is some of the dangerous times ever to live in Oakland, one of the dangerous places in America at that time. Luckily, he had good friends in the Hells Angels motorcycle gang. The Hells Angels had their world headquarters just down the street from his tattoo parlor, and because they used tattooing as a kind of coded insignia of who they were and where they were in the ranks of the Hells Angels, they were in constant need of tattoos and good tattoos and tattooing. So Sam Steward became very close friends with the man at the center of this photograph named Ralph Sonny Barger. I spoke with Ralph, or Sonny as he prefers to be called, Sonny Barger, when I was writing the biography. Sam's excitement about tattooing actually decreased the more that he worked with the Hells Angels, because they were very caught up in crystal meth and a lot of dangerous drugs, cocaine, angel dust, PCP. So they were very dangerous and unpredictable. They carried guns. They were also not the handsome young sailors that Sam had always dreamt about tattooing. They tended to be dark and dirty characters. So as the 60s came to their dark and unpleasant close, Sam realized that it was time for him possibly to shut down the Anchor tattoo parlor and retire. In fact, the death knell for the tattoo parlor happened after 3 assaults on Sam at the tattoo parlor. His next door neighbor, a man named Herman, who ran the local pawn shop, was attacked, and rather than just being held up at knife point or gunpoint, he was actually murdered, and he died on the sidewalk in front of Sam's tattoo parlor while Sam held his hand. It was at that point that Sam saw his own mortality approaching and decided that it was time to shut up the place in Oakland and just move back to the bungalow in Berkeley to begin his new life as a pornographer. This is actually a very fascinating moment. As his own sexuality waned, his excitement about sexuality remained strong, and in order to keep that central sort of life force or drive strongly in focus, he simply began writing about sexuality, particularly the sexual encounters that he remembered so strongly and vividly from his earlier years, which were, of course, exceptionally well documented thanks to the toilet correspondence, the stud file, his diaries and journals. The first collection was called Stud. It was published by Guild Press in 1966. He then went on to publish a whole bunch of extremely erotic gay pulp fiction paperbacks during the early 1970s. This is one of them called The Greek Way. And here he is photographed with his good friend Tom of Finland, who had had a similar trajectory as a homoerotic illustrator working in the late 1950s and 1960s. This is a rare photograph of the two of them in the same room, since Tom, of course, lived in Finland and only came to California once or twice. At the same time, the famous poetry editor Donald Allen, who was also a discoverer of John Ricci, the novelist John Ricci, decided that Sam's Phil Andros fiction needed a reorganizing and repackaging. So in the early 1980s, he worked with Sam to create an edition deluxe of the Phil Andros novels and had the cover illustrations drawn by Tom of Finland. Sam's last years were characterized by a great deal of sadness and isolation. He became heavily dependent. Although he had beaten his alcohol addiction, by the earlier mid-1960s, he was on barbiturates, which is a kind of an alcohol substitute, and he needed more and more of them in order to get sleep at night, but also to feel that pleasant, loopy haze that gave him such a welcome alternative to the loneliness and isolation of his life in the bungalow. He would write poems to his doctor, begging the doctor for new prescriptions for these barbiturates. And they're rather pitiful documents. But in fact, Sam's later years were also characterized by a great deal of successful writing. He wrote his memoir of his friendship with Gertrude Stein and Alice Toklas. He wrote a number of novels, mystery novels featuring Stein and Toklas as characters. He published a novel about his times in Paris called Parisian Lives. And most importantly, he was able to publish a memoir of his life, briefly outlining, not in great detail, the rather amazing things that he'd gotten up to from his days in Columbus onwards. His last years, though, were very much isolated. His last 10 years, he was on oxygen because he had a COPD, pulmonary obstruction, or pulmonary emphysema. And so his mobility was limited, and he became something of a compulsive hoarder. And that meant that at the end of his life, along with all the treasures that he'd collected over the years, there was a great deal of garbage and mess, much of it generated by his beloved dachshunds. This is one of the great last portraits of Sam Stewart, and it was it's a very nice way to remember him because you see so many of the things that he most loved ranged around him in the bungalow. So it took me about 10 years to write Secret Historian, and in putting that book together, I wanted not only to tell the rather sad story of one man who had persisted in failure, not because he was a bad writer, but rather because the world wasn't really ready to hear what he had to say. Writing the book was difficult, but finding a publisher for it was extremely difficult too. And then putting it through the process of getting published was also fraught. There was a great deal of legal reviewing that had to go on, a lot of anxiety that it would be blackballed because it was so strongly interested in male homosexuality and was so graphic in its descriptions and in some of its illustrations. As I mentioned earlier, I published an obscene diary as a companion volume. That way we were able to put the biography out as a mainstream literary title and at the same time include all of these illustrations that are really too powerful to include in a mainstream literary title. Even so, quite a few bookstores wouldn't carry the book. Quite a number of universities wouldn't have me come as a speaker. I think, although I traveled the country to talk about the book for the better part of a year, I was invited only 3 times to universities or museums or libraries south of the Mason-Dixon line. And one of those 3 places was Fort Lauderdale, so I don't really count that. The second of the 3 was a literary festival in my mother's hometown of Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and I did it as a favor to a friend of hers. So there are whole areas of our country where cultural dialogue simply does not include dialogue about sexuality generally, but dialogue about homosexuality is exceptionally limited. And my hope in creating these 2 books and the sort of the critical hubbub that surrounded it was to really try to enlarge that dialogue and somehow to complete Sam's project of bringing sexuality out of the shadows and making it more possible for all of us to simply be, if not entirely comfortable with the discussion of homosexuality, not immediately shutting down that dialogue simply because it makes us uncomfortable. I think sexuality and the discussion of sexuality is always a troubling thing for any number of reasons and for whole sections of our population. At the same time, if you look at the liberalizing trend of the past 50 years, you can realize that we're moving towards the rediscovery of something that has been problematic for many of us for the past 50 years or so. But just since we're at Artist Space, I wanted to bring up a few artists who had also chronicled their days and ways in conceptual art projects that bear some resemblance to Sam Stewart. We have people like Hannah Darboven, On Kawara, Jonathan Borofsky, Hannah Wilkie, John Copeland's, all of whom are talking about the body, sexuality, time passing, the sense of our place in the cosmos or in eternity, trying somehow to make sense of all of the repetition and all of all of the ways in which physicality is problematic to us, and yet with us at every day of our lives, in every moment of our lives. Roman Apolloca chronicling his aging process with a photograph a day throughout the course of his life. There's something of that in Sam Steward, chronicling this endless passage of people that he's had sex with, chronicling the endless days of a life in the tattoo parlor. The diaristic endeavor, the confessional endeavor. These are all something that all artists are familiar with, and that intense focus on the self and interior states, that's something that poets know, it's something that writers know, it's something that visual artists know. When we move off into the world of sexuality, particularly non-mainstream sexuality, images of this sort become extraordinarily difficult for the mainstream viewing public to witness or to read. But that doesn't make it something that's not happening all around us. And I think that particularly now as we moved into a Polaroid generation, but also an intensely narcissistic generation, and furthermore an internet generation where huge amounts of visual material is readily available to us, created at home by people with a camera or a movie projector. There is a kind of numbing quality to it. It can be upsetting and seem dangerous, but at the same time, there's something else going on, which is that it's been demystified, and I think that is good for us all, because as things become less mysterious and more talked about, we're less afraid of them and more able to discuss them. Ultimately, though, I think that Sam Steward will have to be positioned in the art world, if he's positioned there at all, as a Henry Darger-like character, someone who didn't necessarily participate in the art world or the art scene, someone who was not necessarily intent on positioning himself as a creative person, but rather who created an entire world only for himself, and who lived in an apartment, who created a world that becomes a kind of a time capsule of obsession. So just as Henry Darger died in Chicago with his apartment loaded full of all of these amazing, whimsical, scary drawings, we have a similar situation with Sam, who made a few gestures towards the end of his life towards safeguarding his papers. He gave a few of them to Boston University, but for the most part, they became a kind of tomb in which he surrounded himself with all the things that were most important and that told him who he was and where he was in the universe. They become a testament only because his executor was caring enough to go into that bungalow after he died and separate the trash from the documents, from the artworks. Then took care of them for 10 years until I happened to come along. And then I spent 10 years taking this great big messed up bunch of puzzle pieces and sorting them back into place to create a biography that would hopefully complete Sam's project. Though the biography was completed in 2009 and published 2010, there was further life for the Sam Steward archive when I curated the Museum of Sex exhibition entitled Obscene Diary there last summer. Here, for the first time, we were able to present to the public this extraordinary collection of archival materials, which will soon be making its way into a safe archive where it will be protected for future generations. But during that window of opportunity between my finishing the book and the material going to an archive, I was able to put together this beautiful exhibition showcasing not only Sam's achievements as a tattoo artist and designer, but also showcasing his early stud files, his sexual record keeping, his autograph collection, his collection of hairs, his collection of images of people that he'd had sex with, his early writings on his sexuality, and then the Polaroid collection, which is really extraordinary. Here are the Polaroids in their original volumes put out on display for the public to look at the Museum of Sex. The early stud files, some of the stud file cards, and then to showcase as many of the Polaroids as we could, we actually created a bed set up rather like the Murphy bed that I showed you in the early photographs and projected images of those Polaroids onto the bed sheet. Finally, the great collection of Sam's many pulp fiction titles and pornography titles, along with an interview of him done by The Advocate on videotape. It was a great pleasure to see all these books so beautifully arranged in their vitrine. And now I've got to say, it's actually a sort of a landmark weekend for me, not only because I'm speaking at Artist Space, but because on Monday morning, the truck from Yale University will arrive at my home out in Long Island and pack up the entire Sam Steward archive and bring it to this absolutely amazing building, the Beinecke Special Collections Archive at Yale, where generations to come will be able to look at these materials and consider them in close proximity to the accomplishments of people that Sam knew and loved during his lifetime: Alice Toklas, Gertrude Stein, Thornton Wilder, George Platt Lynes. It's lovely that after nearly being thrown into a dumpster at the end of his life, we've come all this way in the course of nearly 20 years, and we're taking this material and making it a part of culture. So that's been my journey, and it's been a very moving one. It's also thrilling that Sam's life will continue to go on. As I just mentioned, Columbus, Ohio, Sam's alma mater, where he felt very much a fish out of water as a young gay man, 2 weeks ago held a symposium in honor of Sam Steward, in which 350-odd queer studies professors from around the United States came and delivered papers on topics related to Sam Steward and his world. I was the keynote speaker for that talk, and we had amazing talks being delivered round the clock for basically 2 solid days. But this symposium will happen every 2 years now, hopefully, as the field of queer studies grows. And it's a kind of a final validation for my project, but also for Sam's lifelong work, much more importantly, Sam's work as a person who was intent on changing public perception of sexuality during his lifetime. So I don't know how we can wrap this up except to say that I'm not alone in this endeavor. Just as I was coming out with my Sam Steward exhibition at the Museum of Sex, the Hide-Seek exhibition was opening and encountering controversy at the Smithsonian Portrait Gallery. The truth about sexuality is that it's right there in front of us all the time, and at the same time, we choose not to see it because it's so problematic. Difference in Desire in American Portraiture did the wonderful job of reminding us that so many of the cultural figures that we esteem and consider part of the American canon are in fact gay people, often creating portraits of gay people. And Sam Steward, George Platt Lynes, Paul Cadmus, they're all part of that world. So even as we are seeing or talking about marginalized biographies happening in the contemporary art world, I think we're moving towards a culture of greater inclusivity, and I think that it's the happiest of results. So thanks, and I'm glad you were able to share that with me.
Thank you very much, Justin. It was a fantastic talk. Does anybody have any immediate questions for Justin? I actually have a question that I wanted to ask. So I was kind of interested in relation to this idea of Sam's project. Is there kind of writings and evidence about how he framed his work in that sense, whether he framed it politically in relation to sexuality and its repression, or whether he was following a more kind of internalized path and he wasn't really framing it in that kind of wider sense? Or?
He framed it, is this still working? He framed that inquiry in terms of confession. He was a lifelong confessor of his own sexuality. So he saw his project as a poetic project, as a person who was fiercely focused on inward realities and inward states. But the desire to confess went through many different manifestations. So as a young man, he was a secret record keeper. As a slightly older man, he was a novelist and poet, writing confessional poetry and confessional novels. Then when society really couldn't handle anything more sexual from him, he moved into a kind of he decided to move inward into a private confessional mode. But there was also a period in which his confessional desires led him to experiment with Catholicism. So he moved away from Methodism to become a practicing Catholic for 3 or 4 years. But he wasn't satisfied with the kind of confession offered by the Catholic Church. And instead, he moved away from religion and away from that sense of decadence that he had been so attracted to in Huysmans, and instead towards science and towards the idea that Kinsey created, which was that through data compilation and through a kind of collection of or confession of sexual habits and practices across the board, across the United States at all different levels of society and populations, there could be a clear accounting of what sexuality actually was, as opposed to what we were told it should and shouldn't be by religion or cultural teachings. So that belief in truth is something that he talks about over and over again in the journals, and the desire to confess endlessly in the journals is based on that feeling that if he has to live an underground life in every other way, there will be one place in his life where he's true, and that's when pen meets paper. Yeah. Yep.
You don't have to, but...
I walked in a little bit late, so I sort of missed the beginning of how you actually came to take an interest in this.
Yeah.
But I don't think you need to reiterate that again. But I'm kind of curious, in your whole involvement in this project, you, as a sexual person, go into it with bringing yourself. Did you come out of it kind of differently, or feel that you were more evolved as a sexual being, or did you or do you feel that you kept your own kind of sexual proclivities or fetishes intact and divorced them from the material that you were working on?
I think it's sort of like working in a donut shop, you know. I mean, I went into it really liking donuts, and I've come out of it. I still like donuts to a degree, but but you can't be exposed to that much sexuality without kind of reaching a point where you think, I think I'd probably enjoy classical music a little bit better, or gardening, or, you know.
I kind of...
But sex is an appetite, so it's always with us, you know, and I think that you become much more aware, and I think that most of the people who have read this book emerge from the reading of it feeling like they themselves have changed. Whether or not they recognize something of themselves in Sam, they've had an experience, a very intense experience of a highly sexual life, which has led them over and over again in the course of reading page after page to question where they are in terms of their relation to their sexuality or their comfort with sexuality.
Right. I kind of expected that sort of an answer, and I guess when I came in, you were talking about the paraphernalia, and you described it as disturbing paraphernalia. And that to me set something off like, oh, okay, he's kind of, even after going through all that material, and he could present a lecture after that, describe it as disturbing paraphernalia, kind of was a key to me as you being a little off. You also mentioned something about not able to love with another man. You were talking about his situation with being a college professor and hunting all these men. And there was some allusion that you made about him possibly settling down with another man or living with another man that would have been impossible or difficult at that time, which it was. But I don't think that this kind of character would be at all interested in settling down with another man.
Well, luckily we have his documents from that early period of his life where he does talk about wanting to have that. So it's not about my surmise. It's something that he says in the documents. That's why over and over again, going back to archival material is such an important part of writing a responsible biography. Of course, I would love to project my own, and I expect at some, you know, on some level I do expect Sam to be my ideal Sam. But over and over again, during the course of the writing of the book, I said to myself, I'm not writing the man that I want this person to be. I'm documenting who he actually was. And one of the reasons that writing sections of the biography were so tremendously disturbing to me were the life choices that he was making, desiring to be murdered while having sex. Things like that were just beyond my almost range of comprehension. I think when I initially saw those, this is a very long journey for me, but 10 years ago when I first saw the collection of maces, blackjacks, billy clubs, whips, paddles, leg irons, I was a little freaked out because I'd never been there,
Right.
and I just didn't know, like, did he really want to be hurt, or was this a kind of play acting, or was this a really hot sex thing that he did? Where was I? I didn't know. He wasn't there to tell me, and I had yet to read any of the accounts. Absorbing that information took the course of many years, and it took me to many places like the Kinsey Institute, where his journals and diaries are kept. It was in the archive, but I had to sort through the archive and read it very carefully to understand what he was actually saying. So, that first piece, those first few pieces of the puzzle that I saw when I was in that San Francisco attic in 2002 did make me jump back a little bit.
Did he talk at all about his aging maybe affecting his ability to find tricks, get involved with tricks?
You should read the book. Yes.
Oh, I plan to, for sure.
Definitely. The most
that's-
moving parts of the book for me are the period when he's about to turn 50 and he realizes that he's become a sexually undesirable older man, that he has none of the power that he had as a younger man in terms of his ability to attract sexual partners. And he has to start buying sex or else doing without. So,
How would you define his friendship with Alice B. Toklas and Gertrude Stein, and how did it affect him directly in his life?
Sam always pointed to Stein as the great mentor for him, and she was a kind of, she existed more strongly, I think, as a symbol of how a liberated and self-possessed homosexual person could exist really at the top levels of culture. But in actual fact, if you read through the correspondence, it's Alice Toklas who's the better friend, the better advisor, and really the great mentor of his middle years. So for many people who read the book, Alice Toklas becomes a kind of shining star of, rational, good advice to Sam in the middle of many doubts and many, relapses into alcoholism or, dangerous escapades. So her presence on the page is very reassuring, and I loved including things that she wrote because she's such a marvelous writer and such a funny, droll person as well.
Do you know what names he used for, I'm assuming you do know, but can you tell us what names he used for his porn publishing and what publications, like Surrey House, or who published him?
Sure. There's a really extensive bibliography in the book, but I would say that for the, let me think now, the first books were published by a guy named Roland Boudreau in San Francisco, who published a number of different gay pulp fiction houses. One was called Frenchie's Gay Line, one was called Gay Parisian Press. Then there were, Surrey House was later. There was, I can't remember the names of the other 2 or 3 publishing houses, but they're all extensively documented in the bibliography. They all treated their authors really, really badly. Part of the sadness of gay pulp fiction during that early period is, although what's being published is dynamic and in some cases highly literate, the authors themselves are being paid rock bottom prices, and their prose is being butchered by people who just want to have hot sex scenes on a page so that they can sell them cheaply. Mm-hmm. Is that it? Oh, one more.
I'm kind of interested in hearing about what Monday's going to be like for you when they cart this material away.
Oh, I've gone through a few cartwheels about it. It's very, very difficult. Last weekend was impossible. I had, 3 weeks ago, I had Steward's executor visiting me from San Francisco and going through every single box. There's a person who advised on the sale for the executor, and he had gone through the boxes also. But somehow things got jumbled, or things that were supposed to be there weren't, or had been misfiled in other boxes. And so we spent a very intense 3 days, right before the Ohio State University conference, in fact, getting that entire archive into order. And I have an enormous feeling of loss, and I mean, so much about the engagement of a biographer with his subject is very much like a love affair, you know, or I should say a marriage, because you're really in bed with that person for 10 years, and you go through your highs and lows, you have disagreements, but they're always there. Then the book is published, and basically the relationship has come to a kind of end, and all you can do is talk about it to other people. So it is like experiencing a death. And now it's like the last part of the death as we clean out all the closets and take it all away. So it's bittersweet. I'm dealing with it, but it's been a tough time. Also, there's a kind of loss of power. You know, when you are in possession of the entire archive, you're the sole authority. And now I'm about to share all of that authority with the world, and I think it's a good thing, because, I mean, at Ohio State University, there are all sorts of scholars who are just dying to get their hands on these papers. But, you know, it's, again, I'm moving from a position of great privilege to one of lesser privilege. Then again, I'm glad to have my life back and to be moving on with my next project. So, thanks. Maybe we should end on that level.
Can I just ask one more question? Sorry.
Okay, yeah.
I just wanted to return to this question of the responsibility of the biographer, if you like, and your responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
If the kind of, in a sense, like Sam Steward's representation of sexuality at certain moments, it was kind of highly radical in a way. How do you feel in relation to being in a position of historicizing that, perhaps, kind of leveling it, if you know what I mean, rather than, you know, of taking it out of a kind of radical context and slightly, not mainstreaming it, but finding a place for it rather than...
Yeah, I think that actually with many artists, the similar thing happens. You have an incredible artist who does something that's so far out and amazing, and it takes several generations to really understand what's happened and to value it. In the visual art system, there's generally a dealer and maybe a widow or a family that kind of support the work after it's come and gone as an exhibition. But you know, that high cultural valuation of what an artist has done really can be 2 or 3 generations in the making. And I think that what has happened with Sam is that because he died alone, and he was very nearly intestate. The person who became his executor within the last month of his life, and really didn't know what to make of what was there. He didn't have that professional system waiting and supporting him as he left, and so I think that traditionally, or at mid-century, gay people were expected to live and die alone, and I think that as a result of that, huge amounts of really wonderful and valuable material ended up in a dumpster, or being thrown out, or hidden, or given away, rather than being considered as a cultural artifact. I think that also that situation has changed an awful lot in the past 25 years, but the time at which Sam died was particularly fraught and difficult because of the AIDS crisis. So even though there were some archives and special collections actively collecting gay-themed material, there was a massive influx of offerings for donations to those archives because so many people were dying simultaneously. So also the orientation of the archivists and collectors who were out there was all towards AIDS crisis rather than towards mid-century gay experience or social history of gays in the United States from 1950 through 60. There was a great feeling during the 1960s and early 70s that the gay men or the homosexual men of the 1950s had been cowards, and their choice not to stand up for their rights, meant that they really weren't worthy of consideration or honor in the way that the gay activists of the 1960s and 70s were. So there was a bias against that particular period, which means that there's a real gap in literature about homosexual experience in the 1940s and 50s. That's one of the great reasons that I jumped in with the project. I really felt that there was something to be said here that hadn't been said anyplace else, and that needed to be said. So I don't think of myself as a person in the vanguard at all. I think look at me, I'm an art historian who moved sideways into, gay pornographer and tattoo artist. But I think it's my careful handling and consideration of those materials which has made my contribution to Sam's life worthwhile. Sam's work was so highly multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary and so revolutionary for its time that it needed not only to be socially and historically contextualized, but also needed to be appreciated as work that was highly literate and at the same time highly pornographic. Not many of my artistry friends are ready to go in that direction, and as a writer and as an art historian, I'm putting my neck out quite a bit as well by associating myself with pornography and with BDSM pornography in particular, I would say. Again, our world is changing and people are becoming much more all-embracing than they used to be. But there are risks involved in being a biographer, and I don't think that people who write the biography of Ronald Reagan are necessarily taking the same kind of risks that I'm taking in the writing of Sam Steward's biography.
Thank you very much, Justin.
Thank you.